Kui Gar Nervod. I am Tad Larkin, the lore master of Manda-LORE, and today I'll be digging through the archives to continue elaborating on the history of the galaxy. Where we last left off in this lecture series, we saw the newly self-crowned Emperor Palpatine round up and eliminate dissident senators to consolidate power, the reconquest of the Outer Rim territories from major CIS holdouts, and a growing list of atrocities committed against many worlds and groups who dare oppose the New Order. We also saw the relentless purge of Jedi survivors and diaspora headed by Darth Vader and the Imperial Inquisition, the blossoming careers of Han Solo, Lando Calrissian, and Leia Organa, and lastly, the formation of the Alliance to restore the Republic, bringing together the formerly separate insurgent groups led by the likes of Mon Mothma, Garmbel Iblis, Bail Organa, and Ram Kota into one unified organization.
Therefore, let this be an official declaration of rebellion. Today, we all vow to change the galaxy. And one day, the galaxy will indeed be free.
Following their harrowing escape from captivity aboard the yet unfinished Death Star, thanks to the sacrifice of Galen Merrick, the signatories of the Corellian Treaty reconvened on the Wookiee homeworld of Kashyyyk to continue discussions and ratify the treaty. Against the reservations of some, including Corellian Senator Garmbel Iblis, the outline of the treaty effectively made the Alliance to Restore the Republic a military dictatorship under Chandrilan Senator Mon Mothma, with the stipulation that once the Emperor was removed and worlds could be reconsolidated, power must be transferred to an elected government and the Republic is to be re-established. Though the Alliance Advisory Council could overturn any of Mothma's decrees with a 2/3 majority vote, it nevertheless began a rift between the Chandrilan and the Corellian. However, Bail Iblis would abide for now. A forward command base was soon erected on the Outer Rim agricultural world of Dantooine, a prefabricated structure near the ruins of the old Jedi Enclave that was destroyed during the Jedi Civil War nearly 4,000 years prior. And ragtag fleets comprised of old Outland Security Force surplus, CIS Navy, and captured/converted Imperial logistical vessels were assembled. With everything now in place, Mon Mothma broadcasted a public declaration of rebellion, with the hopes that scores of systems would be emboldened to take a stand against Imperial rule. But it didn't quite work out as she had hoped. Many star systems and planets, even some of the more openly critical systems, remained silent, and those few who did openly declare sympathy for the rebellion were branded as secessionists and were met with swift punishment from the Imperial Navy. Those within planetary governments with a more quiet sympathy towards the Alliance made it a point to keep meetings clandestine, contributing credits, weapons, and other provisions to the nascent organization. Now that their involvement with the rebellion was known, Mothma and Organa couldn't exactly go back to the Imperial Senate. Bail Iblis was already distanced from Corellia when an attempt on his life killed his wife and children, and Bail Organa had the luxury of living in diplomatic immunity on Alderaan, while his adopted daughter, Leia, who at this point was not known to be involved with the rebellion, took his seat in the Senate. Unknowingly following in her birth mother's footsteps, the hours Leia wasn't spending fighting for the rights of galactic citizens in the Senate Rotunda were spent on mercy missions on behalf of the Alliance, taking great care not to get caught, though many in the Senate were already quite suspicious of the young senator. On the Imperial side of things, the threat of rebellion wasn't taken lightly, and Grand Moff Tarkin, who had since been put in charge of the Death Star project, doubled his efforts to wrap up the already 2-decade-long construction of the Death Star battle station to attempt to regain galactic control. Proving essential to his self-authored Tarkin doctrine, the Death Star would allow the Empire to rule through fear, with the threat of being able to strike down any rebellious planet with one swift stroke at a moment's notice. Seeing firsthand the threat of this battle station during her captivity aboard it, one of Mothma's first moves was to shift the focus of the rebellion's spy networks and spec ops teams to obtaining information on any possible weakness in the battle station to exploit it. These efforts would culminate into Operation Skyhook, with operatives like Bria Theron Jan Ors and Havit Storm taking on the grave responsibility. Lord Vader, meanwhile, took the body of his fallen secret apprentice to the cloning labs on Kamino, now a shadow of his former self since the failed Kamino uprising, where they began several attempts to clone the Force-sensitive Galen Merrick, with varying degrees of success out of scores of failures. You see, since the beginning of the Clone Wars, multiple experiments attempting to clone Jedi had taken place, most famously in the case of X1 and X2, clones of Jedi Master Fallen Grey, but while X2 seemed to exhibit normal behavior, X1 was highly mentally unstable. In fact, they found that most Force-sensitive clones rarely developed without any severe psychological disorders, as would later be seen in the clone of Jedi Master Joruus C'baoth. Out on the Outer Rim, the Corporate Sector Authority, the Imperial-sponsored government of the semi-autonomous corporate sector that we touched on a few transmissions ago, entered into a conflict with the Triani over disputed worlds that the feline humanoids attempted to settle for farming purposes. The war would last for 3 years, ending in a draw. Among the Tabana gas clouds of Bespin, the ex-Imperial TIE pilot turned smuggler Han Solo won the Millennium Falcon from Lando Calrissian in a game of sabacc during the Cloud City Sabacc tournament. In the unknown regions, the Saurian sea rook species of the Sea Ruvi Imperium began their first incursions into the edges of known space, due to dwindling resources in their own holdings, as well as proclaimed force visions from their head of state, the Shriftut. Though these early battles saw them beaten back, the Sea Ruvi would return years later. Around a year before the Battle of Yavin, the first of the more successful Starkiller clones soon began his training with Vader. However, a curious phenomena occurred that had only happened once before in the history of cloning. It appeared that this clone, dubbed a Subject 1138, seemed to inherit the original Starkiller's memories. Plagued by memories of torture at Vader's hands, his help in founding the Rebel Alliance, and his love of Juno Eclipse, the Starkiller clone escaped the facilities on Kamino in one of Vader's prototype TIE Advanced fighters, and sought out his Prime's mentor, Rom Kota. General Kota was currently captive on Cato Nymudia, after a failed Alliance raid saw him, his men, and his space forces under Captain Juno Eclipse herself outmanned and outgunned, but luckily for him, the Starkiller clone came to his rescue as he fought for his life against savage arena beasts for the local Baron's entertainment. Meanwhile, Captain Juno Eclipse, now of the Alliance Nebulon B escort frigate Salvation, briefly went AWOL and established contact with Gail Akbar, the former leader of the Mon Calamari Council before the Waterworld's subjugation by the Empire, now the personal slave of none other than Grand Moff Tarkin. She believed that if the Alliance was to succeed in any sort of space combat against the highly mobile and well-trained Imperial Navy, that a strong, capable leader needed to whip the ragtag Alliance fleet into fighting shape and lead it as a proper naval force. Akbar was more than capable of this in her opinion. Being in the ideal position to spy on the highest echelons of Imperial government, Akbar became aware of the Rebel Alliance and discreetly made contact, and had been feeding them information for months, to the point where he set the Alliance up to potentially capture the Grand Moff, and while that attempt failed, Akbar was able to return to his homeworld. With Juno's help, Akbar managed to get the mixed Mon Calamari and Quarren resistance movements into a position where they could eventually stage a successful revolt against the Empire. Meanwhile, he returned to Alliance command with Eclipse and was given a senior admiral's position, as well as a small fleet. When Mon Calamari, or DAC as it is more properly known, finally did revolt against their Imperial slavers later that year, Akbar briefly returned to his homeworld and began supervising the conversion of pleasure liners, as well as the new construction of Mon Calamari vessels to eventually serve as much-needed capital ships for the Alliance Navy. As for Captain Eclipse, she was captured by the Mandalorian bounty hunter Boba Fett at the behest of Darth Vader, who took her to Kamino to lure the Starkiller clone into captivity. He got more than he bargained for, however, when the Starkiller clone showed up with a rebel fleet led by General Kota. The ensuing battle, combined with duels with both Vader and another Starkiller clone, had an uncanny result. Darth Vader, Sith Lord and apprentice to the Dark Lord of the Sith, was captured and loaded onto a transport bound for the Rebel Alliance base on Dantooine. Records of what happens next are either incomplete or totally missing entirely, so galactic historians such as myself don't have a complete picture of what happened. However, we can presume that Vader was recovered by Fett before even reaching Dantooine, and whatever fallout afterward most likely resulted in the deaths of Subject 1138, Rom Kota, and perhaps even Juno Eclipse, as records of them abruptly cease after the raid on Kamino. Back on Imperial Center, Grand Moff Tracha became weary of the Order of the Sith Lord's grip on the Imperial government, and wished to establish a more secular body to rule the galaxy. So, he took inspiration from the Gentis coup attempt nearly 20 years earlier, and incited a coup against Emperor Palpatine. However, the plot was foiled by Vader, and after the cybernetically enhanced Grand Moff was betrayed by his own co-conspirators and assassinated. On Dantooine, it was soon discovered by one of the rebel pilots that an Imperial homing beacon had been present on the world since before the Alliance even shacked up there, and while there seemed to be no indication that the base had been discovered, Alliance High Command didn't want to risk it, so the base was packed up and moved. Deep in the Gordian Reach sector, a seemingly unimportant moon, one of 26 orbiting the gas giant Yavin, was selected as the new Rebel Alliance base, and from the long-abandoned Massassi temples, Rebel strikes on hundreds of Imperial worlds were orchestrated. At this time, one of the great heroes of the Clone Wars and later the reconquest of the Rim, Jan Dodonna, had become increasingly wary that the Empire had strayed far from the Republic he swore to serve at the beginning of his career, but would rather quietly retire than face Imperial re-education. However, when assassins arrived at his doorstep, he reconsidered past offers to join the Rebel Alliance, and did just so. Orbiting the volcanic world of Sullust, the moon Sulon hosted a Rebel Alliance cell led by Morgan Katarn, whose son Kyle was away at the Imperial Academy on Carida studying to become an officer in the Imperial Stormtrooper Corps. The Mira Luca Dark Jedi, Inquisitor Jarek, led the campaign on Sulon, disguising his transports with Alliance insignias to make it look like the rebels were senselessly massacring the population, when it was in fact Imperial troops. Jarek would behead Morgan Katarn himself, and the raid would be broadcasted on the HoloNet for propaganda purposes. Following Dodonna's defection, several other Imperial defectors began joining the ranks of the Rebel Alliance, including the future famous Rogue Squadron pilot Derek Hobby Clivian and Biggs Darklighter, among others who mutinied aboard the Imperial frigate Rand Ecliptic, after its captain fired upon a defenseless civilian transport carrying school children. On the core world of Fresia, the Incom Corporation, that had produced the likes of the ARC-170 starfighter during the Clone Wars, as well as the Z-95 headhunters the Alliance was currently using, faced impending nationalization by the Imperial government. So, several key Incom engineers and scientists defected to the Rebel Alliance, relaying them information about a new state-of-the-art snub fighter in the works. Captain Ramus Antilles led a small rebel task force to Fresia where, in the ensuing battle, the Incom engineers were successfully evacuated and several prototype T-65 X-Wing starfighters were stolen to be brought back and reverse engineered. The success at Fresia allowed the Alliance to begin full-scale production of X-Wings, and the nimble starfighters were finally put to the test at the subsequent Battle of Turkana in the Pakuni sector. Striking from smaller bases as well as their main one on Yavin 4, the Alliance had been launching attacks on multiple Imperial worlds with varying degrees of success, culminating in what they called Operation Domino, in an attempt to create a domino effect that would lead to the Empire's collapse, with varying degrees of success, but overall it was deemed a failure. The Imperial response was Operation Strike Fear, designed to expunge the rebels from the notoriously tumultuous Tion cluster, and while the Imperials were snatching victories, they were ultimately drawn away from Tion when Sullust revolted, and though the revolt was put down, several key Sullustan sympathizers were recovered by the Alliance. As the Death Star grew nearer and nearer to operational status, Alliance High Command, and especially Mon Mothma, began doubling down on locating and obtaining technical readouts of the battle station. There was one problem, however. The Imperials were smart enough to never keep a complete set of plans to the Death Star in one place at any moment. The plans would have to be hunted down piece by piece, section by section, system by system, the first of which were recovered by Alliance pilot Kian Varlander during an ambush in the Kron Drift. Subsequent raids on Vergesso and Korlag yielded more information about the Death Star, while a few members of the Death Star design team as well as a few officers were captured during operations on Corellia and Imperial Center. On the core world of Raltier, the planet had become increasingly sympathetic towards the plight of the rebellion, which wasn't helped by the existence of an Alliance cell on the world, so the Empire did what they did best, took their no-tolerance policy to the next level and began bombarding the world, which brought out the rebels. In her CR-90 Corvette, the Tantive 4, Princess Leia came to Raltier under diplomatic immunity, transporting spare parts and medical supplies to the civilians injured in the fighting, when her mission was actually twofold. Not only was she bringing medical aid, but also weapons for the Raltier rebels, courtesy of the Alliance. She was forced to flee the planet once the fighting resumed, after nearly getting her cover blown in front of both Darth Vader and Lord Tyon. She fled to the planet Katata in the Colonies region instead of going straight back to Alderaan, as she had been ordered to by Vader, which was a mistake on her part because a small Imperial task force had been ordered to follow the Tantive 4 and arrest her if she went anywhere but Alderaan. Leia and her men, with aid from the Katadan military, were forced to destroy the Imperial landing craft and all aboard, as to not risk them reporting back to Vader that she had disobeyed her mandate, and though the skirmish was won, it wasn't without great casualties, as well as the loss of one of her friends in the Katadan government. Back on the nearly completed Death Star itself, rebel prisoners managed to break out from their cells in the detention level and steal a portion of the Death Star plans, but despite attempts to contain the prison break by the 501st Legion, the rebels got away and fled with the plans to Polis Massa. The rebels were pursued to Polis Massa, and the Alliance base there was leveled in the ensuing raid. However, the men of Vader's fighting 501st were too late. The plans had already been transmitted. At a subsequent battle above Kala 7, the actual location of the Death Star construction site had been revealed to the Alliance. So, in a desperate do-or-die operation, an old former Trade Federation Lucrehulk battleship, Fortressa, carrying at least 500 X-Wings, made light speed for the Horus system to throw everything they had at the battle station. Construction crews on the Death Star, meanwhile, had just finished bringing the station's super laser to operational status, and the gunnery crews were already running drills when Fortressa arrived. Needless to say, the old Lucrehulk didn't have a hope. The Death Star had its first chance to test its super laser on a capital ship and passed with flying colors. It was now time to test the Death Star's full potential, and with Grand Moff Tarkin on board to witness, the battle station turned its focusing dish on the nearby prison colony world of Despire, which housed the legions of slaves tasked to build the Death Star, and fired, obliterating the planet and all those unfortunate enough to be on it. At some point during the construction, the archivist aboard the Death Star, Ator Raitan, gained a bit of sympathy for the rebellion during the horrific tests of the battle station's super laser, and sent an almost complete copy of the plans to a lightly defended Imperial outpost on Danuta to give the rebels a chance. Rebel spy Rihanna Saren was able to report back to Alliance High Command regarding Despire's destruction, and the sending of a large amount of encrypted data to a relatively defended outpost on the mid-rim world of Danuta. Rather than overtly sending in a team of commandos, the Alliance sent 2 operatives acting separately to retrieve the data packages, which were highly suspected to be part of the Death Star plans, Saren herself, as well as a newer recruit, Kyle Katarn, who had recently defected after Jan Ors showed the truth behind his father's murder by Inquisitor Jarek and the massacring of his village on Sulon. With the help of one of Kyle's friends from the Academy stationed on Danuta, who was under threat of being persecuted by his superiors for his religious beliefs, the plans were recovered without a hitch and transmitted to Princess Leia. The final piece of the Death Star puzzle was on the outer rim world of Toprawa, where an Imperial convoy was stopping to take on the final part of the plans before transporting them safely to Imperial Center, so the rebels had to act fast. While an Alliance fleet engaged Imperial space forces above Toprawa, a ground team led by Bria Theron and Havit Storm assaulted the research complex, where they transmitted the plans to Princess Leia in the Tantive 4 awaiting in orbit. Theron and her compatriots held their ground long enough for the plans to finish transmitting before Imperial troops surrounded them and the complex was destroyed. Theron's sacrifice was not in vain, and the final piece of the Death Star plans were combined with the other system sets as one complete package. However, before Leia could flee the system, Darth Vader, commanding the ISD Devastator, exited hyperspace and joined the fray. The Devastator pursued the Tantive 4 all the way to Tatooine, where the blockade runner was finally intercepted and boarded, but before Leia could be captured by the Sith Lord, she hid the plans within the astromech droid R2-D2 and sent it and its counterpart, C-3PO, into an escape pod hurtling towards the planet's surface with instructions to deliver the plans to Obi-Wan Kenobi. During their transit back to the Death Star, and as Imperial troops scoured Tatooine looking for the jettisoned escape pod, the Imperial Senate, which had once stood for 25,000 years as the Republic Senate, was dissolved by order of decree from Emperor Palpatine. Back on Tatooine, the droids came into the possession of Owen Lars, uncle of Luke Skywalker, from which Luke saw a scrambled part of Leia's message to Obi-Wan, and he soon had a run-in with the old hermit after R2 escaped the homestead one day in an attempt to find him. Surviving an encounter with Tusken Raiders, Luke went back to old Ben Kenobi's place, where they watched the full message from Princess Leia, and the hermit revealed to him that he was once a great Jedi Knight, and his father, Anakin Skywalker, was one as well, and he gave Luke his father's old lightsaber. Worried that the Imperials would have traced the droids back to him by now, he rushed home to find the charred corpses of his aunt and uncle. With nowhere to go and no family left, Luke chose to go with Kenobi to bring the droids back to Alderaan, and he would be mentored about the living force and the nature of the Jedi along the way. They traveled to Mos Eisley Spaceport, and after an unpleasant encounter in Chalam's Cantina, they were able to charter Han Solo and his Wookiee first mate Chewbacca to bring them to Alderaan aboard the Millennium Falcon. By this point, Han had already accrued a massive debt to his boss Jabba the Hutt, when, during a previous smuggling run for the Hutt crime lord, he had to jettison his cargo of illegal spice after being intercepted by an Imperial patrol, so he was more than happy to take on this job, especially for 20,000 credits. However, he'd soon find that he may have gotten more than he bargained for. On the Death Star, multiple torture sessions refused to yield the location of the rebel base from the feisty princess, so Grand Moff Tarkin had another idea. He aimed the super laser at Alderaan and promised to fire if Leia did not give up the location of the base, and while she did give a location, the wrong one as they'd later find, Tarkin ordered the planet to be destroyed anyway. Around 2 billion beings, including Bail Organa, perished in Alderaan's destruction, leaving tens of thousands of Alderaanians off-world at the time, homeless, with lost friends and family members. As horrific as the event was, the planet's destruction did bring attention to the rebel cause, and many used "Remember Alderaan" as a rallying cry against the injustice of Imperial rule. During transit to Alderaan, Kenobi taught Luke more of the Force, and brought out an old Jedi training remote for him to learn the basics of lightsaber combat. However, when they arrived in the Alderaan system, they found nothing but debris, before they were pulled into the Death Star's tractor beam. Hiding in the Falcon's smuggling compartments to avoid capture, they stole uniforms off of the stormtroopers assigned to inspect the Falcon, and discovered that the princess was being held captive aboard the station. Kenobi would disable the tractor beam, while Luke, Han, and Chewie made their way to the detention level to recover the princess, and after multiple firefights and nearly being crushed by a garbage masher, they made it back to the Falcon. Before they left, Luke witnessed Kenobi and Vader fighting in a nearby corridor, distracting the stormtroopers, and unlike their previous duel on Mustafar, the former master allowed his former apprentice to best him, sacrificing himself so that Luke could escape. Evading TIE fighter pursuits, the Millennium Falcon and passengers made it to the Alliance base on Yavin 4, where the Death Star plans were analyzed, and luckily a weakness in the battle station was found before the Death Star itself arrived, having found the base after placing a tracking device on the Falcon. Skywalker, known bush pilot back on Tatooine, climbed into the cockpit of a T-65 X-Wing and joined Red Squadron as Red 5, along with his friend Big Star Glider and another future Alliance hero, Wedge Antilles, to assault the Death Star in an all-or-nothing gamble to bring down the technological terror and save the Rebel Alliance. The battle didn't start off that well for the Alliance. Several pilots made a pass at the thermal exhaust port that would set off a chain reaction and blow the reactor if a proton torpedo was shot down it just at the right place, but none had yet to hit it. To add to it, the squadrons of X-Wings and Y-Wings were being torn apart by turbo-laser fire and enemy TIE fighters, one piloted by Vader himself, but after focusing and trusting in the Force, Luke got off the lucky shot that hit the exhaust port just right, and the Dark Lord was sent into a tailspin after being fired upon by Han Solo in the Millennium Falcon. The Death Star, along with Grand Moff Tarkin and several other high-ranking Imperials, were destroyed, and this historic moment would go down as not only one of Luke Skywalker's and the Alliance's greatest accomplishments, but also a turning point in the Galactic Civil War and galactic history itself. The celebration in the throne room was short-lived. The Alliance knew the Empire would be back to wipe out their base the old-fashioned way. With help from the massively influential House Taj and the ships belonging to their multi-company conglomerate, the Imperial Navy was able to cordon off a large swath of the Gordian Reach sector in an attempt to contain the rebels. Luke Skywalker, hero of the Battle of Yavin and Jedi in training, was sent on multiple scouting missions to find a new base for the Alliance, and after unpleasant encounters on Drexel, Jarnalin, and Salume, Luke found the remote Arctic tundra world of Hoth in the Greater Javin sector, long forgotten since the new Sith Wars 1,000 years prior, and noted it as a potential base location. Meanwhile, Leia and the droids attended dozens of diplomatic rendezvous in an attempt to gain sympathy for the rebellion from unaligned worlds, escorted by Han Solo and Chewbacca, who, after a few run-ins with some associates of Jabba the Hutt, who now had a large bounty placed on Solo's head after he failed to pay Jabba back, decided to stick around and throw their lot in with the rebels. Appalled by the destruction of Alderaan, another core world, Dental, decreed that it would no longer recognize the authority of its imperial governor. The Empire responded by releasing the Kandorian plague in the planet's capital city and placing the entire Dental system in quarantine. Mara Jade trusted Emperor's Hand with help from a rogue squad of stormtroopers calling themselves the Hand of Judgment, put down Shord's dreams of independence during a skirmish on Shel Kanwa, and they unknowingly had some help from Han Solo, Leia, Chewie, and Skywalker before Vader's fleet arrived to handle the situation. In recognition for his service during the Battle of Yavin, as well as subsequent missions in the few months since Yavin had been blockaded, Luke was given command of Rogue Squadron, made from the remnants of Red Squadron, and one of his first missions as commander was to pick up an Imperial defector on occupied Dantooine, Tycho Selchu, who would end up becoming one of Rogue Squadron's most celebrated pilots. For the Imperials, the 6-month-long siege of the Gordian Reach had gone on long enough, and if it weren't for setbacks with several members of House Taj attempting to usurp the Emperor's favor from Vader, the battle would have been over much sooner. Vader himself was prepared to lead the assault on Yavin 4 aboard his newly completed Superstar Destroyer Executor. However, it had sustained damage from the sacrifice of Vrad Dodonna, Jan Dodonna's son, during a rebel ambush in the Fesway corridor, so Admiral Griff led the attack. Withstanding bombing runs from TIE bombers and ground assaults from Imperial stormtroopers, most of the Alliance personnel, weapons, and hardware were successfully evacuated from Yavin 4. However, not all of the High Command made it off the moon, as Jan Dodonna was captured while trying to rig the base to explode. The rebels, however, would mark him KIA. To avoid logistical headaches, the Alliance didn't resettle on the newly discovered Hoth right away, instead attempting to settle a few small bases on Thilia and even Bospity until resources could be replenished enough to begin construction on what would become Echo Base, but for now, the High Command would reside with the Alliance fleet. The Alliance managed to snatch victories at Lugbang Minor, Kallist 6, and Keskin, while at Jabim, they attempted to aid the Jabimai rebels against Imperial subjugation. However, they were double-crossed, and a majority of the planet's populace were pressed into Imperial slavery and sent to labor camps. 8 months after the Battle of Yavin, a little-known Chiss male, Senior Captain Thrawn, managed to prove himself in the Unknown Regions, commanding the Star Destroyer Admonitor against the alien warlord named Nuso Esfa, whose expanding territory was getting too close to Imperial borders. In the Tingle Arm region out near the Zipan sector, the Rebel Alliance nearly met its end when an Imperial sleeper agent managed to betray the location of the Rebel fleet while staging at Deep Space Besh. An Imperial task force led by Vader and the Executor caught them by surprise and proceeded to rip the Rebel fleet to shreds. But through the heroic actions of Skywalker, Organa, and Wedge Antilles, several capital ships and frigates managed to make the jump to hyperspace. However, the Alliance flagship, Rebel 1, a converted Providence-class cruiser, was damaged beyond repair and used to blow up an Imperial refueling depot in the subsequent engagement. As if having the main Alliance fleet decimated wasn't enough, Garm Bel Iblis, one of the founding members of the Alliance to restore the Republic, parted ways from the organization after disagreeing with the direction Mothma was taking the Alliance for years, as well as suspecting that Mothma would attempt to use the rebellion to acquire power for herself. The old Corellian and those loyal to him wouldn't stop fighting the Empire though, waging his own private war against the Imperials and achieving a great victory at Tangerine, before later being presumed dead. In reality, he managed to stumble upon the long-lost Katana fleet that I mentioned in a past transmission, and took 3 dreadnoughts for himself, lying low to get the large target off of his back. With Akbar back on deck, the pressure was on for the Mon Calamari and Quarren to crank out new capital ships to replenish the tattered Alliance home fleet, and on Hoth, Alliance engineers broke ground and started construction of Echo Base. By 1 ABY, in the wake of the Death Star's failure, General Rom Mak of the Imperial Department of Military Research won over Emperor Palpatine with his Dark Trooper project, an initiative to introduce war droids of his design called Dark Troopers into the ranks of Stormtroopers and Imperial Army troopers. The successful demonstration of the Dark Troopers during an attack on Tillay prompted the Alliance to send its 2 best agents, Kyle Katarn and Jan Ors, to find out more about these Dark Troopers and shut the project down, and their search led them to Anowat, Nar Shaddaa, and even the Executor itself, before locating the Dark Trooper factory ship Arc Hammer and eliminating it, as well as Rom Mak. The Emperor's focus shifted back to the Death Star 2, which had started construction shortly before the Battle of Yavin, while Vader was hell-bent on finding and eliminating Rebel outposts, with the hope of finding Alliance HQ, where he could stamp out the Rebels once and for all. He also learned the identity of the pilot who destroyed the Death Star, Luke Skywalker, his own son who he had previously thought perished with his wife decades ago. Needing to keep the Empire on their toes since the disastrous loss at Deep Space Besh, the Alliance continued to conduct raids to keep up the pressure, many of which were led by Commander Luke Skywalker and Rogue Squadron. The rogues struck at Corellia, liberated Gerard 5, halted Imperial Walker production on Balmorra, rescued Wedge Antilles from captivity on Kessel, disrupted Tabana gas supplies on Talaran, and resecured the Alliance's back to supply during the attack on Thyfera. A year and a half after the Battle of Yavin, in a secret ceremony on Imperial Center, now Admiral Thrawn was promoted to Grand Admiral Thrawn, the 13th Grand Admiral out of a position traditionally held by only 12. Being an alien, Thrawn faced an uphill battle in the rampantly xenophobic Imperial military and still managed to rise through the ranks. However, his fellow Grand Admirals were keen on seeing Thrawn taken down, and he was soon exiled to the frontier on the edge of the unknown regions to perform mapping missions. His exile was actually by design. Not only did it placate his other 12 Grand Admirals, but the Emperor also tasked Thrawn to establish an Imperial satrapy, the Empire of the Hand, in the unknown regions, to serve as a buffer state and give the Empire time to mobilize in the event of an invasion by the far outsiders that I mentioned earlier in this series. On Shalivane, the Empire assaulted the world to create a credible backstory for Vader to insert one of his agents, the Force-sensitive Shira Bree, into the ranks of the Alliance, and she even managed to get assigned to Rogue Squadron under Skywalker, where she would rise through the ranks and gain their trust, all while reporting back to Vader. By this time in history, the Black Sun Crime Syndicate had not only recovered from the assassination of Alexei Garen and the other Vigos by Darth Maul before the Clone Wars, but were now thriving under the Falleen Prince Shizor, and he himself managed to work his way into Palpatine's inner circle. Shizor convinced the Emperor that the Bounty Hunters Guild had become a challenge to Imperial power in the underworld, and tasked Boba Fett to infiltrate it and destroy it from within, which he did, culminating in the small schism known as the Bounty Hunter Wars. In 2 ABY, Luke escorted Leia to a diplomatic mission on Ser Carpois IV in order to convince the rebel Cell there to join the Alliance. However, Leia's Y-Wing had an engine malfunction, and they crash-landed on Ser Carpois V, aka Mimban. Hoping to escape the Imperial-occupied world, Leia and Luke agree to help one of the locals find and retrieve the Kyber Crystal, a Force-imbued gem that, when possessed, increased a Force user's power tenfold in exchange for transport off-world, and after escaping Imperial captivity and some trouble with the native Koei, they managed to reach the Temple of Pomojima where it was enshrined. The local Imperial governor tipped off their presence on Mimban, and Vader arrived to take them into custody himself. Leia made the first move, grabbing Luke's lightsaber and engaging the Dark Lord in a futile duel, which incapacitated her. Luke came to her defense, and with the Force flowing through him and a little guidance from Obi-Wan's Force Ghost, he managed to take Vader out of the fight. Luke would use the Kyber crystal to heal Leia, however, when it was taken away from the temple, the crystal lost all of its powers and was abandoned. Vader kept the crystal nevertheless once he recovered from the duel. At this point, Thrawn returns from his expedition in the unknown regions, and, implementing a plan devised by him, Vader and his fleet, which became designated Death Squadron, began raiding known smuggler hideouts and shadow ports in an effort to cut off the Alliance's supply lines, which they chiefly maintained through smuggling networks, as well as to learn the location of the new rebel base. Around this time, another crime syndicate begins to come into prominence and challenges the authority of not only Black Sun and the Hutts, but also the Empire and Rebellion alike. Tiber Zahn of the Zahn Consortium conducted several raids with the goal of building a paramilitary force to assert his dominance, stealing everything from deactivated battle droids left over from the Clone Wars to Keldabe-class battleships straight from Imperial-occupied Mandal motors, and even Sith artifacts from the Imperial Museum on Imperial Center. By 3 ABY, the Alliance began catching wind of the Imperial strategy to eliminate smuggler hideouts and shadow ports that feed them weapons, material, and information, in an attempt to locate their new secret base on Hoth. So, Luke and Han were sent on a diversionary operation to make it look like the Alliance had established a base on Ord Mantell to throw the Imperials off. On a subsequent mission to Ord Mantell, Luke, Leia, Han, Chewie, and the droids managed to pull off a heist to steal back some of the Organa family fortune for the Alliance, despite being double-crossed by a bounty hunter that had infiltrated the rebels in order to collect a bounty on Solo. At Dera 4 in the expansion region, a task force led by Grand Admiral Thrawn intercepted an Alliance supply convoy heading to the rebel base and completely annihilated it. And although the location of the new rebel base was not ascertained, they were able to estimate that it was located somewhere in the greater Javin sector. The Empire proceeded to blanket every known planet in the sector with probe droids, one of which found its way to Hoth, where it transmitted images of the Echo Base shield generator to the Executor before being destroyed by Han Solo and Chewbacca. Under orders from Vader, Admiral Kendall Ozzel brought Death Squadron out of light speed. However, he did it too close to the planet with the intention of surprising the rebels, which ended up just giving the Alliance more time to activate their planetary shields. Ozzel was subsequently executed by Vader and replaced by Admiral Firmus Piet. The Alliance wasted no time mobilizing ground forces while transports were loaded up, and while being covered by ion cannon fire, the transports would attempt to slip past the Imperial fleet. Imperial ground assault troops led by General Maximilian Veers began to assault the rebel defenses, overrunning their trenches, while rebel snowspeeders attempted to tie the legs of their AT-AT walkers, which worked to a degree. However, Veers was still able to knock out the base shield power generator. Though the Battle of Hoth was now lost, Alliance ground troops managed to hold off the Imperials long enough for the base to be evacuated, and the ion cannon worked to provide the transports with an adequate escape window. Leia, Han, Chewie, and C-3PO were the last to make it off Hoth, and since Solo was unable to fix his hyperdrive before having to blast off from Echo Base with stormtroopers in pursuit, they led squadrons of Imperial TIE fighters in a chase through the Hoth asteroid field. Luke Skywalker, meanwhile, traveled to remote Dagobah after receiving a message from the Force Ghost of Obi-Wan Kenobi shortly before the Battle of Hoth, and he met with former Grand Master Yoda in exile and resumed his Jedi training. Evading Vader's Death Squadron, Solo managed to limp the Millennium Falcon at sublight speeds to nearby Bespin, where he reunited with now Baron Administrator of Cloud City, Lando Calrissian, and trusted him to make repairs to the Falcon's hyperdrive so that he could rendezvous with the rest of the Alliance fleet. They soon found out that Boba Fett had tracked them to Cloud City, and Vader had arrived just before they did. The Sith Lord intended to use Skywalker's friends as bait to lure him into a trap, where he could be captured and brought to the Emperor to be turned to the dark side of the Force. He intended to do this by means of carbonite freezing, much like the human colonists did in the ancient pre-Republic days, and tested the method on Solo. The smuggler turned rebel hero was then handed to Boba Fett, who intended to cash in Jabba the Hutt's bounty. When Luke arrived, he appeared more of a match than he thought he would, and it was clear he wouldn't be captured so easily. So their duel was drawn out to the point where Vader had him backed in a corner, and after cutting off Luke's right hand, he told him the truth. Anakin Skywalker wasn't dead. He, Vader, was Luke's father. In utter disbelief and refusing Vader's pleas to join him and rule the galaxy together, Luke plunged into a chasm where he was later rescued by Leia, Chewbacca, and Lando, who had regained a bit of Leia's and the Wookiees' trust after explaining that his hand was forced by Vader, and helping them and the rest of Cloud City's inhabitants escape. Leia, Luke, Lando, Chewie, and the droids blasted out of there and regrouped with the rest of the Alliance fleet at the edge of the Galactic Disk, where Luke received a new cybernetic hand and the gang readied themselves for finding and saving Han Solo. Bringing Solo to Jabba wasn't as easy as heading straight for Tatooine as Boba Fett would have liked. His path was waylaid by scores of other bounty hunters such as Bosk, Zuckuss, IG-88, and Forlom, and throughout the shootouts and shaky alliances, he still had to outrun Lando, Leia, Chewbacca, and Luke, who were in pursuit. Their mission to save their friend had to be put on hold a few times, however, as their duty to the Alliance would sometimes get in the way of their loyalty to Han. Lando and Luke found themselves aiding the Ugnaughts in retaking Cloud City from occupying Imperial forces, and later Luke and Leia led a mission to destroy another would-be Imperial superweapon, the Tarkin. The disaster on Hoth led to the Alliance High Command residing permanently with the Home Fleet, aboard Admiral Akbar's MC-80 flagship, Home 1. From here, the Rebel Alliance would enact a stateless strategy, hitting Imperial targets either directly or with detachments from the fleet, but always the fleet was mobile, and thus hard to detect. During a mission to intercept an Imperial fleet carrying a hyperwave amplifying anomaly known as a Teasel, Luke Skywalker and Rogue Squadron flew captured Imperial TIE fighters to catch the fleet at unawares. However, when they initiated their attack, the Imperials quickly caught on and began jamming their communications, which they used to keep track of friends versus foes in the ensuing TIE fighter on TIE fighter dogfight. For the other rogues, it was difficult, but Luke was able to use the Force to separate his allies from his enemies, but by doing so, he shot down Lieutenant Shira Bree's fighter, and believing he had mistakenly killed one of his comrades who was also becoming a love interest, Skywalker appeared before an Alliance court-martial. In the course of his suspension, Luke discovered that Bree had been an Imperial agent the entire time, reporting to Vader himself nonetheless, and Luke was acquitted and accepted back into the Alliance. Shira Bree, meanwhile, was recovered by Vader and rebuilt cybernetically, becoming Lumaya, and under Vader's further training, she was accepted by the Emperor as one of his hands. On one of the occasions Leia found herself able to actually continue her quest to find Han, she traveled to Manda-LORE in search for Boba Fett, but instead found someone in similar Mandalorian armor, Fen Shisa. Shisa was leading a ragtag force against the Imperial occupation of Manda-LORE, who had enslaved his people, stripped them of their traditional Beskar armor, and forced them to mine the durable metal. And while Shisa had no idea as to the whereabouts of Fett, Leia agreed to help them. With Leia's help, Fen Shisa and the Mandalorians were able to oust their Imperial oppressors, and after she left to continue her search, Shisa was declared the new Manda-LORE, and the Mandalorians donned their Beskar gam once again and began reclaiming the Manda-LORE sector from Grand Admiral Milton Tackle. 3.5 years after the Battle of Yavin, Prince Xizor had finally infiltrated Palpatine's inner circle, and from there he would undermine Vader in an attempt to gain the Emperor's favor and hopefully eliminate Vader in revenge for his family's murder during the cleansing of Falleen. Emperor Palpatine, meanwhile, had begun to devise a plan to eliminate the Rebel Alliance once and for all. He would allow the plans for the second Death Star to fall into Rebel hands, where he would lure them into thinking that the battle station was unoperational, so that when they launched a foolhardy assault on the station, they would discover that it was a trick, and the Rebel fleet would be destroyed by a combination of super laser fire and pressure from the Imperial fleet. To accomplish this, Xizor offered up one of his transports from his company to carry the Death Star plans and had his agents in Black Sun tip off the Bothan spy net, leaving it open to be grabbed by the rebels. All the while, Vader was continuing his task to capture Skywalker, who the Emperor wished to turn to the dark side. So he posted a substantial bounty with the condition set to alive. Xizor knew this and posted his own bounty, his set for dead. Luke met the first of these attempts on his life when he returned to Tatooine. Looking through Obi-Wan's notes and journals in his old homestead, he even began constructing his own lightsaber when the bounty hunters attacked. He was luckily saved by Dash Rendar, a smuggler hired by the Rebel Alliance. With Dash's help, Luke aided the Bothans in raiding the Xizor transport system's freighter Suprosa, where they recovered a computer core with sensitive information on it regarding a top-secret Imperial weapons project. They brought it to the Bothan colony on Kothlas to be decrypted, and while the Bothans were successful, Luke was captured by bounty hunters and a battle ensued on Kothlas when the Empire showed up to, quote-unquote, stop the rebels from stealing the computer core, which, after much fighting and many dead Bothans, the data was brought to Alliance High Command. Meanwhile, Leia and Chewie, disguised as bounty hunters, made contact with Black Sun to find out who put the bounty on her friend Luke, not knowing that Xizor himself had done so, and they found themselves briefly in his captivity in his palace on Imperial Center before Luke, Lando, and Dash arrived. Xizor's Black Sun Palace was blown to smithereens, and he retreated to his orbital Skyhook, sicking his squadrons of Star Vipers on the fleeing Millennium Falcon and Outrider, but an unlikely force ended up coming to their aid. Fed up with Xizor's constant undermining and furious that he put a hit out on Skywalker, Vader ordered Xizor to stand down and surrender himself before the Executor opened fires on his Skyhook. The Prince and Black Sun Vigo didn't respond in time, and the Fallene's fist was destroyed. Dash Rendar was unfortunately killed in the engagement, but his sacrifice allowed the Falcon to get away, or so everyone thought. Xizor's death, however, wasn't greatly exaggerated, and the subsequent power vacuum it created set Black Sun back to the chaos it was in before the Clone Wars. Seeing his opportunity amidst the discord during the skirmish above Imperial Center, Grand Admiral Demetrius Zarin attempted the third and final coup attempt against Emperor Palpatine, and even recruited one of his own hands, Arden Lin, to his side to aid in the kidnapping. He was foiled by Vader, but retreated to the Outer Rim, and he would have brokered a deal with the Rebel Alliance, exchanging the new state-of-the-art TIE Defenders, if it weren't for Grand Admiral Thrawn, who, at the Emperor's behest, conducted a campaign against his wayward colleague, finally defeating Zarin in the Unknown Regions, from which Thrawn would return to the Empire of the Hand to continue overseeing its development until he was ever recalled again. By 4 ABY, the constant missions for the Alliance and being led in circles with their search for Han weren't all in vain, as Luke, Leia, Lando, Chewie, and the droids got word that Boba Fett had finally delivered their carbonite-encased friend to Jabba the Hutt on Tatooine. First, the droids were sent to Jabba's palace with a message from Luke explaining that these droids were a gift of good faith, as he prepared to bargain with the Hutt crime lord in exchange for Han Solo's life. Jabba expectantly laughed at the preposterous proposal. Next was Leia, who used her Ubi's bounty hunter disguise to bring Chewbacca to Jabba's palace, feigning a claim to the smaller secondary bounty on him, and in the dead of night, she unfroze Han, who was hanging like a trophy in Jabba's throne room. She herself was soon caught and taken captive. Skywalker soon showed up himself, and when Jabba attempted to throw him to his pet Rancor, the Jedi Knight killed the Dathomiri carnivore, so the gang were rounded up and taken aboard Jabba's sail barge to be thrown in the Sarlacc in the Great Pit of Carkoon. Thanks to Lando Calrissian, who had infiltrated earlier and was masquerading as one of Jabba's guards, as well as R2-D2, who had Luke's new lightsaber in storage, Luke was able to rescue Han and Chewie, and after Leia strangled the Hutt crime lord to death, they escaped before the destruction of the sail barge. While Luke briefly returned to Dagobah, where he spoke with a dying Yoda, who revealed to him that he had a sibling, as well as the Force ghosts of Ben Kenobi, Han, Lando, Chewie, and C-3PO returned to the Alliance fleet for a special briefing. The computer core from the Kothless raid had been decrypted, and the second Death Star under construction was discovered. To add to that, the Emperor himself was scheduled to be visiting the battle station on an inspection tour, so if there were ever a time for the Alliance to make their move, it was now. Skywalker, Solo, and Organa, as well as the Wookiee and the droids, volunteered for the ground mission to disable the shield generators surrounding the station, located on the moon of the gas giant Andor, while Calrissian and Rogue Squadron would fly into the exposed superstructure and knock out the reactor once the shields were gone, covered by Admiral Akbar leading the Alliance home fleet. The ground team went first, using a stolen Imperial Lambda-class shuttle to slip past the fleet, and though their credentials were outdated, Vader, sensing that Luke was aboard, allowed them to pass. Just after Luke came to the revelation with Leia that they're in fact brother and sister, while Han, Chewie, and the droids were mingling with the native Ewoks and planning their next step, Luke surrendered himself to Vader, wishing to redeem the man who he had come to accept to be his father. Meanwhile, a diversionary Alliance assault was conducted on Imperial-occupied Sullust, leaving the Alliance fleet open to travel down the Sanctuary pipeline, and when they dropped out of hyperspace, they discovered that the Death Star was very much operational, and a large Imperial fleet was lying in wait, ready to sandwich them. Back on the Forest Moon, the primitive but ferocious Ewoks diverted Imperial ground troops as best as they could, while Han, Leia, Chewie, and their commandos infiltrated the shield bunker and planted their explosive charges, destroying the generator, leaving the Death Star vulnerable. As Lando, Wedge Antilles, and Tycho Celchu flew their craft through the superstructure en route to the reactor, Luke was brought before the Emperor and goaded into attacking his father in an attempt to turn the boy to the dark side of the Force. Palpatine had watched the father-son duel drag on long enough after Luke managed to cleave off one of Vader's hands. The Dark Lord of the Sith would suffer the stubborn Jedi no more. If he would not turn, he would die, and began blasting him with Sith lightning. Yet seeing this, something overcame Vader, and he saved Luke by lifting up his master and hurling him down a reactor shaft. As both the ground battle and the duel began to turn in the Alliance's favor, the space battle did as well. A brave A-Wing pilot's last-second sacrifice knocked out the Executor's bridge, and the Super Star Destroyer plunged into the Death Star's surface. Meanwhile, Lando, Wedge, and Tycho successfully hit the Death Star reactor while evading TIE fighters. With his dying breaths, Vader, now Anakin Skywalker once more, was able to reconcile with his son before succumbing to his wounds. Luke took his body aboard an escape shuttle as the Death Star was crumbling around him, and brought him back to the Forest Moon for a proper Jedi funeral. Now that the Emperor was dead, the battle meditation technique he used to coordinate the Imperial fleet and boost morale was gone as well, and the Executor's destruction sent the fleet into complete disarray, only being held together by acting Captain Gilad Palion of the Chimera following Admiral Horst's death. He ordered the remnants of the fleet to retreat to Winaj. In the wake of the Emperor's death, dozens of worlds were emboldened to secede against their Imperial masters, and a breakdown in command structure occurred with a ruling council led by Grand Vizier Sate Pestage established on Imperial Center, while dozens of other Moffs, admirals, and governors began having dreams of establishing their own miniature empires. The Galactic Empire was on the brink of fragmenting. As for the Alliance to restore the Republic, the celebrations were short-lived on the Forest Moon of Andor, as the next day, word reached the Alliance that the Imperial world of Bakura had come under attack by the Sea-Ruvi Imperium, looking to take over the planet and infect its populace to fuel their warships. Much to the Bakuran's surprise, a rebel fleet came to their aid rather than an Imperial one, but the beleaguered Imperials welcomed any help, and Leia brokered a temporary truce with their governor, and after joining forces and beating back the Sea-Ruvi, hostilities resumed as soon as the Saurians had jumped to hyperspace. Not long after, the first Conference of Free Peoples was held, and the Alliance to Restore the Republic was reorganized into the Alliance of Free Planets, an interim government to hold the Alliance together while the Declaration of the New Republic was being drafted. But the newly dubbed Alliance of Free Planets were unable to immediately take their fight to liberating the rest of the galaxy from the remnants of the Empire, as another militant species began its invasion of the wider galaxy. But these invaders weren't from the unknown regions, but an entirely different galaxy. The Nagai had made the trek from their home galaxy of Companion Besh, the satellite galaxy orbiting the main one, when they were overrun by a rival warlike race, the Tof. Allying themselves with Lumaya, now stylizing herself as the Dark Lady of the Sith now that Sidious and Vader were gone, the Nagai launched their assault in the Galactic Southern Quadrant, moving on Herdessa, Kashyyyk, Kantros 7, and Kinnuine. On Kinnuine, Luke Skywalker faced off against Lumaya, and after the Dark Lady of the Sith bested him once, he then constructed a lightsaber Shoto to contend with her light whip, and challenged her again. Only after defeating her did he learn the truth. His old flame, Shira Bree, was Lumaya, and she hated him ever since that fateful day when he shot down her TIE fighter. Luke spared her life, as is the Jedi way, though he'll later come to regret it. Thankfully for the Alliance, Fen Shisa and his fearsome Mandalorian protectors came to their aid, and together they defended Endor from the Nagai invaders. However, at the Battle of Zeltros, the Nagai's old enemies, the Toff, expanded into the wider galaxy as well, and engaged hostilities with their ancient foes. Coming to an understanding, the Alliance ceased hostilities with the Nagai and agreed to help them against the Toff, so they could safely return to their home galaxy. And at the Battle of Seijo, a joint Alliance Nagai coalition defeated the Toff forces of Prince Sereno, and upon his capture, he was forced to capitulate. Both the Toff and many Nagai returned to their home galaxy. With disaster averted, the Siruvi and subsequent Nagi-Tof conflict showed the galaxy that the Alliance of Free Planets was strong enough to hold its own against a military threat and protect its member systems, and as a result, more worlds continued to shed their Imperial shackles and apply for Alliance membership. In the midst of this, the final draft of the Declaration of the New Republic was completed, and at their temporary headquarters on Endor, the document was signed by Mon Mothma, who would serve as the first Chief of State, Princess Leia Organa, the Bothan Borsk Felia of Kothlas, Admiral Gael Akbar of Dak, Sian Tev of Sullust, Jensar Sobilis of Duro, Dorman Barus of Corellia, Karathrar of Kashyyyk, and Vernefra Bathog Indrumiskeg of Elam. The worlds of these 9 signatories would become the founding worlds of the New Republic, ushering in a new era of democracy returning to the galaxy. But first, the shattered remnants of the Empire needed to be contended with to liberate the galaxy from their tyranny. However, that is a topic for another transmission. This ends my findings on the Rebellion era. Stay tuned for the next transmission of this lecture series, where the New Republic era will be discussed. Special thanks to my patrons, Wildcat144, Zexend, JTrips1997, Wirefox Terrier, Dave the Grave, AJ Can't Think of a Good Pun Right Now, Sim the Despot, Matt Patton, Trav, Hawk2274, Cal Scarata, Angry Mutt, Chris Evans, Mayo4, and Epileptic Zebra. If you'd like to support this channel, and perhaps even commission your own video topic, please visit my Patreon to find out how. Link is in the description. In the meantime, keep your comm channels open for future transmissions, and don't forget to subscribe. Tad Larkin, out.